The four norms are speed, ownership, science, and openness. On the speed one to start with, I want to ask you to describe it. One of the things that really stood out to me is plan less and iterate more is one of the things you said. And, working with Peter Thiel, there'd be times when I want to talk about something we were going to do or talk about something we should analyze. He was never interested in that. He's just do it and then come back to me with it. It was just this culture of let's just go fast and let's talk about this again in an hour after you guys have done that work. And there was no waiting a month or a week or anything. It was just go,
Yeah. And I didn't know that about Peter. I didn't know that he was wired so much that way, but he overcomes this very deep-seated human tendency that we have. I think it's so deep-seated that Danny Kahneman gave it its own label. It's called the planning fallacy. We are just super overconfident in our ability to upfront map out what's going to happen. We think we can do it. Everything from how long your home renovation is going to take to what the customer wants. We're just overconfident in our ability to know the future and plot a course through it. We're not. We're actually fairly lousy at that. Peter's insight, the insight of a lot of geeks that I work with, is that you need to do some planning. You need a minimum viable plan. After that, the only way you're going to learn about reality and learn about what the customer wants or learn about how long your kitchen's going to take is to start doing stuff and getting valid feedback on the fastest possible cadence.
100%.
So for me, the great geek norm of speed, velocity is not the right synonym. Cadence or clock speed or pace of iteration is the right synonym. Just get good feedback and then try it again.
100%. I love this because right now we're working a lot on all these AI possibilities, and I have these young geniuses on my team, and they come out of academia and PhD programs their whole lives, and there's this instinct to overplan everything and talk about it for so long. I'm like, you know what, guys? Actually, let's just hire a few of these people and let's try building this and seeing how it works, and then let's get feedback from the industry and let's try again. And but Joe, how could you start something when we don't even know for sure what's going to work? And I'm like, well, that's how you do it. You start trying, right? You start iterating, you start going, and it's the Silicon Valley mindset to start building and trying things. I think it is very different than how the rest of the world approaches things.
I agree. And I think it's one of the keys to your success. When I talk to industrial era companies about this, the immediate pushback I get is that sounds fine for building a consumer web application, but there are mission critical things out there, and there are things that we cannot get wrong. And I say, I completely agree with that, but you're making the mental error of smashing together the way you develop a thing versus whether or not the thing can fail. And to make that concrete, SpaceX is the only American company that has built a capsule that is authorized by NASA to take human beings up to the ISS and eventually onto the moon and maybe Mars, right? Mm-hmm. They're the only ones that did that. There's nothing more mission critical, I think, than keeping people safe in space. SpaceX is the only one that can do that these days. And the way they did it is not by planning a ton. As you probably know really well, that company are fanatics about iteration and getting feedback. Meanwhile, NASA, which got a bigger contract at the same time that SpaceX did to build the capsule, they have not yet had their first crewed test.
Yikes.
This iterative approach is the way to learn quickly and improve, even if what you're trying to do is very mission critical and failure intolerant.
I love that. Let's move on to the second one. You write a lot on ownership. It means a lot of different things to you. Tell me what you mean by ownership.
For me, it's kind of the opposite of bureaucracy, and everyone would nod their heads to that. Here's the tougher part. It's also, in some sense, the opposite of cross-functional coordination and process and structure and hierarchy. Now, I'm not saying that ownership equals chaos or equals anarchy, but it involves a lot less of all of those things than we became fond of in the industrial era. Joe, I don't know if you're old enough to remember the era of business process reengineering that really got kicked off in the early to mid 90s.
I read a lot about it. It sounds terrible.
But no, the fact that you just said that is interesting because to your ears, it sounds terrible. I cannot tell you how good it sounded to us, me included, when we first heard about it in the mid-90s.
Well, you had to fix the processes, I guess, huh? There are too many processes.
We're going to define in advance all the things this company is going to do. We're going to embed them in software, and everybody has the same sheet of music to play from, and we're going to make beautiful music together. And we did that. We did that for a long, long time. And we wound up with these very top-heavy, sclerotic kind of bureaucracy, barnacle-encrusted companies that found it very hard to move quickly or to kind of, liberate their people at all. And what you and your your geeky cohort are doing is figuring out how to build companies that are still very good at executing, right? But don't have that same kind of crazy overhead associated with it. Amazon is one of my favorite examples because they're a gigantic company now, but they still have this philosophy of like, kind of what's the minimum amount of production.
They got rid of their NPIs you talked about, right? Because they used to do this horrible thing in the 90s.
Oh yeah. I didn't know this at all. Amazon was actually well on its way to being exactly this kind of top-heavy bureaucratic mess. If you wanted to innovate at Amazon in the late 90s, you submitted your idea to this innovation bureaucracy that would pass judgment on it, and then they would tell you if you got to proceed, if you didn't get to proceed, but you didn't have to support anybody else, or if you didn't get to proceed with your idea and you had to support a bunch of other ideas. This was just this absolute misery inside Amazon. Bezos realized that it wasn't working, that it was jamming the company up. And so in this great book, Working Backward, written by a couple of ex-Amazonians who were there, they said, okay, and Bezos said, to his great credit, my first preferred approach for managing innovation at this company is wrong. And we're going to go 180 degrees in the opposite direction. We're going to build a company where you don't need to ask anyone's permission and you don't need to resource seek from anybody if you want to try something new.
I love it.
And that involved completely modularizing and decoupling the technology stack. That's the birth of Amazon Web Services and to a large extent the cloud industry now, and also this organizational decoupling. And what the authors of Working Backwards said is we learned over time that when we set this up, and they had 2 pizza teams initially, the teams that worked the hardest to reduce their dependencies were the ones that were most successful later on. They quote Bezos as saying, if Amazon is a place where builders get to build, we have to cut down on the communication. And Sebastian Thrun, who's an amazing alpha geek, said the same thing. He said, look, I tell my teams, it's not that don't ever talk to anybody, but if you run your idea up the flagpole and then back down the flagpole, it's going to be almost unrecognizable by the time it comes back to you. Just go do stuff.
This is how Steve Jobs did innovation as well. He'd create these groups that were totally separate, and he wouldn't let anyone else reach in and interfere. I think the quote was that like if you have a committee design a horse, you're going to get a camel. And so you need to have the groups be totally separate, and he'd have ones that only he could talk to. So it's just very interesting. It's a similar framework, for all these guys.
Yeah, and Apple is a very secretive company in a lot of ways, but part of what they're trying to do is, I think what you said, they're just trying to encapsulate innovative teams so that they don't get bogged down in all of the crossfire that goes on in a company, which was done with good intentions, but the end result wasn't great. So the business geeks said, all right, we're not doing that anymore.